Welcome back, everyone, to episode 4 in our look at the history of Russia. I hope you guys have been enjoying it so far. If you're new to the series, you didn't see the first 3 episodes, there's a link in the description that'll take you back to episode 1. We are going to be looking at Epic History TV's series on this subject, using that as our discussion. And the goal here, if you're new and you haven't been around long, is for us to all learn together. I expect to learn some things today that I did not know. I'll try to share some things with you that I can add to the conversation, and I want to invite you to do the same thing. So at the end of the video, if you haven't already, please take the time to hit the like button and then leave a comment and let me know something you learned today you didn't know before, or share something with all of us that can add to our knowledge of the subject of what we've talked about today. I have nothing else to add. I want to go ahead and dive right into this.
(1825). Victory over Napoleon had confirmed Russia's status as a world power. But there was discontent within Russia amongst intellectuals and army officers.
So take a minute. We talked a little bit about this already, but take a minute and think about in 1825, with the technology that exists in that time, what it would be like to try and manage an empire that large, to manage that vast an area of space. Now, granted, there's not a lot of people out here in places like Siberia. It's very sparsely populated, but still, just, you know, the weeks and probably even months it must have taken for communication to get from one end of Russia to the other and back. You think it's bad with the British having to try and communicate with their empires. At least they can do that by sea, which is a little faster. This is over land. It must have taken forever. And so you have to have a lot of trust in the people that you've placed in positions of authority in those situations.
Some of whom had formed secret societies to plot the overthrow of Russia's autocratic system. When Emperor Alexander was succeeded, not as expected by his brother Constantine, but by a younger brother Nicholas, one of these secret societies used the confusion to launch a military coup. But the Decembrist revolt, as it became known, was defeated by loyalist troops, and the ringleaders were hanged.
There's actually, I don't remember the name of the movie, but there's clips on YouTube, and honestly, there's some of the best examples of the use of things like canister fire that I've ever seen put on film. I'm going to look it up. I want to see what it's called. Okay, so the name of the movie is Union of Salvation, and I'm not going to show a clip because I don't want to have any copyright issues, but here's an example of just a screenshot of what was happening, and you see the fighting taking place, and it's so good. I mean, it's really top-notch stuff. I highly recommend you check it out. Just type in Decembrist revolt in your search in YouTube, and some of these clips will come up. It's fantastic stuff. It's really, really well done.
Was sent into internal exile in Siberia. This was to become a common sentence for criminals and political prisoners in Tsarist Russia.
I mean, because if you think about it, if you're being exiled to Siberia, you may have as well been exiled to another country. I mean, it's just a whole other world. It's that far away. There's probably low likelihood that you're going to ever trouble the government again.
Went on to adopt an official doctrine of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. The state was to rest on the pillars of church, Tsar, and the Russian national spirit, a clear rejection of the values of European liberalism. In the Caucasus, border clashes with Persia led to a war which ended in complete Russian victory. The Treaty of Turkmenchay forced Persia to cede all its territories in the region to Russia.
And Persia would be roughly the equivalent of the modern state of Iran in terms of, the land area that they cover and kind of the historic nation that they've become.
And pay a large indemnity. Russian support for Greece in its war of independence against the Ottomans led to war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire.
Again,
Russian victory brought further gains in the Black Sea region.
And at this point, the Ottoman Empire is in the decline that will ultimately end less than 100 years later with the elimination of the Ottoman Empire, and they will be succeeded by what we know today as Turkey. But yeah, we've talked about this over and over again. These are just longtime rivals and enemies. They're fighting over the same territory. They have very different values and very different religion, one being Muslim, one being Orthodox. And so things like Russia helping Greece is really about sticking it to the Ottomans and weakening further the Ottomans so that then they too can come after the Ottomans.
A Polish revolt, led by young army officers, was crushed by Russian troops. Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet, was shot in a duel, and 2 days later died from his wounds. Nicholas sent troops to help put down a Hungarian revolt against
1848-49, revolutions are breaking out all over Europe. This was just a huge time of upheaval. I mean, 1848 is one of those years where there's just massive upheaval. France has a revolution. They've got the one there in Hungary, and of course this is going to lead to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a dual monarchy that will end with World War I.
Austrian rule. The emperor's willingness to help suppress liberal revolts won him the nickname the gendarme, or policeman, of Europe. Russia's first major railway was opened, connecting St. Petersburg and Moscow. Alexander Herzen, a leading intellectual critic of Russia's autocracy, emigrated to London, where he continued to call for reform in his homeland. He'd later be described as the father of Russian socialism. The Ottoman Empire, now known as the sick man of Europe, reacted to further Russian provocations by declaring war. The Russian Black Sea Fleet inflicted a crushing defeat on the Turks at the Battle of Sinope. But Britain and France, alarmed at Russia's southern expansion and potential control of Constantinople, declared war on Russia.
Which is kind of fascinating that Britain and France were so concerned about Russia having Constantinople. This is really not so much about being allied with the Turks, allied with the Ottomans. This is more about keeping Russia from getting too powerful and just kind of keeping them in check. And of course, interestingly, then 60 years later, they're going to be on the same side in trying to keep Germany from becoming too powerful. This is all about balance of power. It's all about making sure that you're on a side that is equal or stronger than the people on the other side. And anytime you see somebody start to get a little too big, a little too powerful, you got to knock them down a few pegs.
The Allies landed troops in Crimea and besieged the naval base of Sevastopol, which fell after a grueling year-long siege. In the Baltic, British and French warships blockaded the Russian capital, St. Petersburg. Russia was forced to sign a humiliating peace, withdraw its forces from the Black Sea, and put on hold plans for further southern expansion. Nicholas I was succeeded by his son, Alexander II. The Crimean War had exposed Russia's weakness. The country lagged far behind its European rivals in industry, infrastructure, and military power.
And which is interesting because, people like Peter the Great, Catherine the Great were cognizant of that and did their best to try and westernize, so to speak, Russia so it could keep up. Imagine with the manpower and the resources that Russia has, if they could just keep up in terms of industry, what a ridiculously powerful nation this would be. But they fall behind on that stuff, and every so often they fall behind, and then somebody comes along who leads them into catching up. But they always seem to be lagging behind, which is why people always have that kind of historic idea that Russia just throws manpower at problems because they don't have the industry or the resources. They have the raw materials, but they don't have that turned into something that can be of use, and so they just throw manpower at it. Not entirely true, but there's some truth to it.
So Alexander, unlike his father, decided to embrace reform. The most obvious sign of Russia's backwardness was serfdom.
Yeah.
According to the 1857 census, more than a third of Russians were serfs, forced to work their master's land with few rights, restrictions on movement, and their status passed down to their children. They were slaves in all but name.
And as we mentioned before, the big difference between serfs and historical slaves in places like the United States, for example, is, in the U.S. you could buy and sell slaves. In the serf system in Russia, it was more tied to the land. So you couldn't just sell a serf to another landowner, but you could sell the land to someone else, and the serfs who were living and working on that land would go with that land. So it's a form of slavery, but it's much more tied to the land than it is to the owner itself.
In 1861, Alexander II abolished serfdom in Russia. He was hailed as the liberator.
Right about the time that, the American Civil War begins in 1861, same year. So right about the time that this is happening in the United States. Somebody mentioned the other day that it's a couple more decades before Brazil abolishes slavery, so that becomes one of the last. But just because the serfdom ends does not mean that they're necessarily free.
But in reality, most former serfs remained trapped in servitude and poverty.
And that is not unique to this system. In the United States, when slaves were freed, partially by the Emancipation Proclamation, but that was a temporary war measure and it didn't apply to all slaves. Slavery officially ends in the United States in December of 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. At that point, all slaves are no longer slaves, but the problem is that in the South, they start passing these state laws and local laws that put such restrictions on the freedmen's ability to work and function in society that a lot of them end up signing contracts with their former owners to work the land, to live on the land, to have their food, their room and board paid for basically, but nothing else. And they were bound by that contract, and those contracts could be bought and sold. And so basically they signed themselves back into an effective slavery, even though slavery was technically abolished. Same kind of thing happening here with the serfs.
Alexander's reforms would continue with the creation of the Zemstva, provincial assemblies with authority over local affairs, including education and social welfare. In the Far East, Russia forced territorial concessions from a weakened China, leading to the founding of Vladivostok, Russia's major Pacific port. Another uprising by Poles and Lithuanians against Russian rule was once more crushed by the Russian army. In the Caucasus, Russia's long and brutal war against local tribes came to an end, with their leaders swearing oaths of loyalty to the Tsar.
And again, echoes of what will come in the future. I mean, just in my lifetime, we've seen fighting against the Chechnyan people. Russia invading Chechnya and taking that back over and putting down rebellions. And that's the kind of stuff that goes on to this day.
In Central Asia, the Russian Empire was gradually expanding southwards. Russian armies defeated the Emirate of Bukhara and the Khanate of Khiva. And by the 1880s, Russia had conquered most of what was then called Turkestan, today the countries of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Imperial rivalry in Central Asia between Russia and Britain led to the Great Game, a 19th century version of the Cold War. Centered on Afghanistan,
And there again, big foreshadowing of what will come in the 20th and 21st centuries with long, protracted, difficult, unwinnable wars in Afghanistan.
Diplomats and spies on both sides tried to win local support, extend their own influence, and limit the expansion of their rival, while avoiding direct military confrontation. Russia decided to sell Alaska to America for $7.2 million.
$120 million for basically what amounts to, I don't know, like a third of the United States territory today, maybe a fourth, something like that. It's tremendous. At the time, though, William Seward, who was the Secretary of State for the United States, it was called Seward's Folly, or sometimes Seward's Icebox. People thought it was a joke. Why would you buy this empty, barren icebox of a land for any money, let alone for $7 million? But then they found gold, and suddenly it became a big, big deal.
Many Americans thought it was a waste of money. Gold and oil were only discovered there much later. Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace was published, still regarded as one of the world's greatest works of literature. The late 19th century was a cultural golden age for Russia, a period of literary greats and outstanding composers. Russia, in support of nationalist revolts in the Balkans against Ottoman rule, went to war with the Ottoman Empire once more.
Again.
Russian troops crossed the Danube, then, with Bulgarian help, fought to secure the vital Shipka Pass. Then they launched a bloody 5-month siege of Plevna.
And just for context, this is a few years after the Franco-Prussian War. 1871, we see Germany united as an empire, becoming the power, the great land power in Europe. So, you know, if you're Russia looking at this, okay, now Germany's suddenly very powerful and they're right on our border. Where can we grow? Where can we expand? Where can we increase our influence and increase our strength? And it's right back to the Ottomans again.
Bulgaria.
This time Germany,
Russia,
this time the UK and France are in no position to do anything about it.
And her allies finally won victory, with their troops threatening Constantinople itself.
I should mention, too, that, you know, France has been weakened by the Franco-Prussian War. The UK is increasingly focused on Africa. They're about to go to war against the Zulus in South Africa, so they've got their hands full other places. This is the perfect opportunity for Russia to do this while everyone's back's turned or they're too weak to deal with it.
But at the Congress of Berlin, Russia bowed to international pressure and accepted limited gains, in a settlement that also led to independence for Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, and later Bulgaria.
Once again, a weakening of the Ottoman Empire, and you're going to see in the next 30 years or so, you're going to see more fighting happening in this region, and it's the Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, who toward the end of his life, 1898, as when he dies, I think, he said something about how there would be a huge war break out, and if it did, it would be some fool in the Balkans that would light the fuse of what was called the powder keg of Europe in this region, and that's exactly where World War I starts.
Meanwhile, within Russia, radical political groups were increasingly frustrated by Alexander II's limited reforms. There were several failed attempts to assassinate the emperor, but as he prepared to approve new constitutional reforms, he was killed in St. Petersburg by a bomb thrown by members of the People's Will, one of the world's first modern terrorist groups.
And, you know, it's such a fascinating thing when this kind of stuff happens, because this is the guy who was most likely to reform the Russian Empire. And he gets murdered, and he gets replaced by a guy who has no interest whatsoever in making reforms. Similar to what happens when Gavrilo Princip kills Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and in less than 2 years would have become the emperor when Franz Joseph dies in 1916. And I wouldn't say he was he was on the side of the Serbians, but he certainly was much more pro-Serbia than most of the people in the government were, and they kill him.
This act of violence would lead only to a new era of repression.
Yep. Exact opposite effect of what they wanted.
Did you know
all right, so we're going to wrap it up right there. We'll come back tomorrow with the next part. I have gone live with the complete 6-part video of my visit to the Somme battlefields. It's set up as 6 chapters and all in one video. It's about 2 hours long. So if you want to see the complete collection, I'll put the link up in the description, or up on the screen, so you can check that out. This weekend, episode 1 of my look at the battlefields and locations associated with the United States involvement in World War I will go live with my visit to the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. Hope you'll check it out. See you again tomorrow with more. Thanks for watching.